Hey, what's up everybody? How you doing? Welcome back to Karpogaming and another Borderlands 4 video. Well, the huge new update is finally here. We have a bunch of changes to all the Fallen Hunter, but they all bust. Today we're going to go over the brand new patch notes right here, right now. You know what to do. Leo! Once again, thanks for watching everybody. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. Now we have some huge changes to Amon, Vex, Rafa, and just a few changes for Harlowe in today's patch notes. So let's go over them. Links down below if you want to jump into the section you want to. First off, weekly activities. Weekly Big Encore boss has switched to a tougher variant of a different existing boss with an even more rewarding loot pool for those that take it on. The weekly wild card mission has changed. These missions feature a guaranteed legendary drop that you can repeat and get the idea roll. Maurice's Black Market vending machine has moved to another location. I'll have that video coming up soon. And remember, while the locations is the same, your vending machine items are different from other players, so ask around to see what other players have. Now, next up we have additional changes. They have added auto clearing of Borderlands 4 stale shaders on version updates, preventing performance degradation on some PCs. We also have character balance adjustment. Here it comes. Drum rolls. Harlowe. Action skills 0 point. Stasis slam damage increased by 30% and stasis immune damage increased by 14.7. For Rafa, action skills Aphio slants increased damage by 10%. Capstone people's person. Projectile Raiju damage now scales by 12% per second up to 10%. Project Brasculus damage increased by 15%. Hazard damage increased by 25%, and Gorgon damage increased by 17%. For the passive people person, El Katrine critical damage increased to 8% from 7% per point. Her My Last double damage chance increased from 6% to 5% per point. Action skills Arc Knives. Melee attack damage increased by 12%, dash increased by 5%. Passive this year's gimmick Handshake Deal melee damage increased to 9% from 7% per point. To the last, skill damage increased from 8% from 6% per point. El Pergius. Splash damage increased to 9% from 7% per point. Liquidation damage increased by 50%. Collaborative Ignition. Bonus damage increased to 8% from 6% per point. Sangria. Duration increased to 14 seconds from 12 seconds. Melee damage increased to 4% from 3% per point. And Epijui. Action skill duration increased to 7% from 6% per point. Now, next up we have the Vex changes. Action skills Incarnate. Phase explosion damage increased by 16.6%. Eldritch Blast damage increased by 9.5%. Augments Vexcalation. Energy Vampire damage increased by 25%. Capstone's Vexcalation. Heart Piercer damage increased by 22%. Desecration Hazard damage increased by 50%. Airborne Burst damage increased by 48%. And Geist Wave damage increased by 41%. For the passive Vexcalation, Radiant Attunement now did 7% splash damage, up from 6% per point. Dead Light Hazard damage increased by 100%. Ars Arcana now increases skill damage by 9% from 8% per point. Action skills Phase Philomar. Trouble Health increased by 10%. Trouble damage increased by 21.9%. For the augment, here comes Trouble. Violent Outburst damage increased by 12.5%. Vorpal Fang damage increased by 34%. Capstone, here comes Trouble. Trouble double damage increased by 33%. Passive, here comes Trouble. Blood is Magic now increases action skill damage by 8% from 7% per point. Claw and Bang now increases melee damage by 8% from 6% per point. And the passive, the fourth seal. Fill Inscription's melee damage increased to 7% from 6% per point. Reoccurrence now increases melee damage by 0.2 per stack from 0.16 per point. And Harpsiax Phase Dagger damage is increased by a whopping 11.7%. Moving on, for Amon, action skill Scourge now has its maximum vengeance increased by 50%, making it able to absorb more damage and deal more damage with 4 whip when consumed. 4 whip damage is increased by 27%. For the Augment Vengeance, Blast Chill damage increased by 45%. Molten Reboot damage increased by 86%. Eternal Winter Massive 4 Wave damage increased by 100%. Stormland damage is increased by 52%. And Stormland's detonation damage increased by 10%. For the Capstone Vengeance, Glacial Rupture now has a 60-second cooldown down from 70 seconds. Also, Forge Whip damage increased by 16%. And Fissure damage increased by 41%. For the Raffle damage, that's going to be increased by 46%. For the passive Vengeance, Scorch Kyrios now increases Ordnance damage by 6% from 5% per point. Battleborn now increases gun damage by 4% up to 3% per point. Scar Tissue now increases maximum health and rep kip healing by 9% up from 8%. Eternal now increases action skill duration by 5% up from 4% per point. World Breaker damage increased by a whopping 50%, and Winter Kiss now increases damage dealt by 10% up from 8% per point. And Strike the Anvil now deals 15% of the damage dealt up from 12% per point. Next, we have the action skill Crucible. 4x damage increased by 12%. Double Edge Twin Forge axe damage increased by 10%. For the Augment Cybernetics, Axe and Stone's action skill cooldown restoration increased to 40% from 33%. Axe and Stone's action skill ordnance restoration increased to 40% from 33%. Endless War gun damage taken increased to 20% from 50% per prime stack. Hour of Hammer Forge damage increased by 14%. Blade Tempest 4 Swords damage increased by 13%. And Blade Tempest 4 Swords detonation damage increased by 4%. Next up, we have the Capstone Cybernetics. Now, for this one, Snowed Maul damage increased by 38%. Storm Surge impact damage increased by 10%. Forged Storm damage increased by 60%. Conflagrating Capstone Fire Tail damage increased by a whopping 100%. Next up, we have the passives for the Cybernetics. Gathering Storm now increases elemental damage by 3% per stack, up from 2% per stack. Executioner now increases critical hit damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Destruction Engine now increases forge skill damage by 6%, up from 5% per point. Destruction Engine now increases detonation damage by 8%, up from 6% per point. Tempered Prior Forge axe damage increased by 19%. Tempered Ice Forge hammer damage increased by 18%. Masterwork now increases Forge drone damage by 10%, up from 7%. Masterwork now increases Forge drone's duration by 8% from 5% per point. Tempered's Lightning Forge sword damage increased by 13%. Lightning Rod elemental bolt now deals 40% of the damage dealt, up to 30% per point. Escalation now increases Forge drone's attack speed and movement speed by 5%, up from 3% per point. Honed Point now increases Forge drone's critical hit chance by 5%, up from 4% per point. And Heat Exchange now increases Cairo and Incendiary damage by 8%, up from 7% per point. Next up, Action Skills Onslaughter. Onslaughter shield regeneration is increased by 15% per second from 10%. Onslaughter Rocket Punch damage increased by 78%. Molten Slam now has a 60-second cooldown from 80 seconds, and Molten Slam damage increased by 50%. For the Augment's Calamity, Field Frost damage increased by 71%, and Fluting Fist damage increased by 69%. For the Capstone Calamity, Hard Cleave now has a 55-second cooldown from 65 seconds. Hard Cleave damage increased by 11%. Hard Cleave detonation damage increased by 18%. Molten Royal now has a 70-second cooldown from 80 seconds, and Storm Cutter now has a 65-second cooldown from 75 seconds. And the damage is also increased by 65%. For the passive Calamity, Heavy Plate now increases maximum shield capacity by 7%, up from 6% per point. Will the Storm now increases status effect damage and status effect duration by 7% from 6% per point. Tritanium Knuckles now increases melee damage by 8%, up from 7% per point, and now increases skill damage by 4%, up from 3% per point. Harbinger now increases melee damage by 2% per stack, up from 1% per point, and Modal Flare damage increased by 22%. And last but not least, Judgment now increases melee damage by 10%, up from 8% per point. So boom, there you have it. The full patch notes is here, and yeah, it's awesome. Nothing but buffs all around for all the Vault Hunters. But for right now, that's pretty much going to for the video. Hope you truly enjoyed it. Now, as always, if you're new to the channel, how you doing? Welcome. Don't forget to subscribe. Right here at Karpo Gaming, upload a wide variety of videos. So once again, thanks for watching. And as always, I'll be seeing y'all in the next one.